It's been more than 15 weeks since a white police officer shot and killed a black teenager in Ferguson, Missouri, becoming a flashpoint for debate across the country. Even as a prosecutor tried to explain why there was no indictment last night, tensions boiled over. And now tonight, protests are forming around the country as Ferguson residents assess the damage to their own community. The light of day revealed the extent of the unrest that erupted in Ferguson last night. Police cars and buildings burned to the ground, windows smashed, businesses looted. Later, an attorney for the Brown family expressed their outrage about the outcome of the case.
We object publicly and loudly as we can on behalf of Michael Brown Jr.'s family that this process is broken.
That process, a grand jury hearing and deliberations, was painstakingly laid out by St. Louis County Prosecutor Robert McCullough, who waited until after 8 p.m. local time to address an anxious community.
Decisions on a matter as serious as charging an individual with a crime simply cannot be decided on anything less than a complete critical examination of all available evidence.
He spoke for nearly 10 minutes before finally revealing the grand jury's decision.
They determined that no probable cause exists to file any charge against Officer Wilson and returned a no true bill on each of the 5 indictments.
McCullough then laid out the details of the case, but by then the crowds were not listening and began to express their disappointment and anger. Hundreds remained calm, but after the stepfather of Michael Brown started to call for violence, imploring people to burn the expletive down, things took a nasty turn, even as the president was about to speak.
I join Michael's parents in asking anyone who protests this decision to do so peacefully.
The events in Ferguson are particularly troubling to my first guest. Jabari Essam grew up in the St. Louis suburb. He's now the executive editor of Crisis Magazine, which is published by the NAACP. Welcome back to Greater Boston, Jabari.
Thank you.
So tell me what it was like living there.
Well, there's been some changes, but mostly the St. Louis area has been divided in terms of north and south. So the north side was all African American, the south side was all white, and there's a dividing line called Delmar Boulevard, and you seldom crossed one way or the other. So very segregated, I would say. And when you talk about racial tension there, was it a constant presence? Was it something that you were just always aware of? What was that like day to day? Well, I was in an interesting position because though I lived on the north side, I actually went to school on the south side because I was in special programs. So once I crossed Delmar Boulevard, I was always very aware that I was in another world and often met hostility. I was called racial epithets on the way to school. Sometimes people would just say things like, "You're a little far south, aren't you?" So that's always been going on. So what world was Michael Brown in that day, that August day? The north side world. So it's North City and then there's North County, which is where Ferguson is. So presumably he was in his own neighborhood. Right. Yeah. Right. So not too much has been said about the length of the indictment and some of the things that were in it, and almost to the point where some of the facts seems dismissed, including to the point about the fact that Michael Brown had gone into that convenience store and taken some cigarillos and roughed up the owner. Is that at all relevant to this? The fact that, and then he came out in the middle of the street and, the cop asked him, was he taunting people? Well, I think the question is who is shaping the narrative. And I think part of the problem that those of us who are very familiar with the area have is that McCullough has a history of shaping the narrative to suit his own ends. So even though that data supposedly came from testimony from eyewitnesses? Well, I think first thing you do is discredit the witnesses when you want to get away with murder. And the grand jury too? It's hard to say. Not only am I from St. Louis, but I've been on a grand jury in St. Louis. So most of the time, the grand jury operates as a rubber stamp of the prosecutor. And this doesn't appear to be a deviation. Yeah, that's true. But it's also most of the cases, police officers and people in law enforcement don't get indicted. So this follows that pattern. And we're talking about a community that's 67% black, and there were 3 black people on the jury. Mm-hmm. So there is that disproportion as well. Yeah, and we don't know how they came down on this, and we may never know. Although my guess is we probably will, that somebody will be able to talk to those grand jurors. Yeah, but the whole thing from the very beginning, it had an aura of suspicion, of skepticism, based on McCullough's long history of questionable behavior in the prosecutor's chair.
All right, Jabari Essam, thanks so much for your insights on that.
My pleasure.
All right, well, lawyers for Officer Darren Wilson issued a statement after the announcement that he would not be indicted. In it, they say they've always maintained that Wilson's actions were in accordance with the law and that he followed his training. They went on to say, we recognize that many people will want to second-guess the grand jury's decision. We would encourage anyone who wants to express an opinion to do so in a respectful and peaceful manner. For more on how this ordeal fits into a larger conversation about race relations, I'm joined now by Jack McDevitt, who is the director of the Institute for Race and Justice at Northeastern University, and Peniel Joseph, who is a Tufts University history professor and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. Welcome to you both. I could feel you both nodding over my shoulder when Jabari talked about Prosecutor McCullough. I mean, is it that entrenched that even before the grand jury announcement was made that people knew that this would be the outcome because of his track record?
Well, I don't know about his track record. I think that, unfortunately, it's a track record around the country. This is not a Ferguson issue. This is an issue that could happen in any community across our country, unfortunately. And the vast majority of times that a police officer acts in a violent way towards anybody, they're going to be found not guilty, or, as we hear, a no indictment. So I think that the problem is we don't want to focus it too much on Ferguson, because that means that it's not our problem. And this is our problem.
No,
every community.
But I think we need to a little bit, because going back to my question about the grand jury and the amount of data, I'm sure you read through a lot of it today, as we all did. It seems to me that in certain sectors of the society, it's just been completely dismissed. That it is incredible that Officer Darren Wilson's account of what happened isn't credible, that the conclusion that the grand jury came to isn't credible. I mean, so that's why I think it's important to stick to this, that yes, it's happened the other way, but it's focusing on this and saying, well, if the system is that tainted, we have a larger problem.
Yeah, I think the whole thing about credibility in the grand jury, I think, yeah, that's a great discussion, but I think the biggest issue in Ferguson is these issues of poverty, these issues of racial segregation, public school segregation, and why was Michael Brown in that position anyway, right? So even if we
what
take
do you mean,
it
in what position?
In that position to be, you're not armed, even though he had taken some cigarillos from a store. You're in your own neighborhood, and you get into this tussle with an officer. You're unarmed, and you end up dead, and you're 18 years old. And I think the big anger that we saw last night, especially these were young millennials who were angry, right?
Yeah.
Is because of their lack of opportunity and their lack of hope. So Ferguson has become a metaphor for race relations in the United States. And I think this is a real lesson for millennials, because so many young people hear about the civil rights movement. There's a King holiday, there's a Selma movie coming out in December, and now they're seeing these big explosions right on their television sets, and they're wondering why. Like, why do all the black people live in a neighborhood that I don't live in? How come I don't go to school with any black people, right? Is this about just black behavior and their individual problems and pathology, so-called, or is this a larger structural problem, right? And I think that this is really an important time for us. And the sympathy demonstrations that we saw nationally were peaceful. So the interesting thing is that, yes, there's violence in Ferguson, but there's peace all around the country.
I keep wanting to bring it back to this, because I would think that even on that logic, that the people of the city of Ferguson who sat on that grand jury would say, you know what? On that point, we should go the extra mile and indict this guy, even if the evidence is thin. Let's do it for this reason alone. And they didn't.
Right. Well, I think that what we know from other kinds of cases, and we know from what the comments of some of the people that were involved in this, is that they want to believe, they want to take the position of the police officers. Police officers is a risky job, and they want to say, okay, how much would I be in fear if this was happening to me? Of course, there wasn't the other side presented to them.
Well, there never is in a grand jury. You only hear one side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that people, what the research says is that people want to believe the police officer. They want to believe the police officer is acting in their best interest. Because at the end of the day, a police officer friend of mine said that if people can't go to the police and they can't go to the courts, all they've got left is to go to the streets. And that's what we see happening. If we don't have trust in those institutions of the police and the courts, where can we go?
A lot of people have expressed skepticism and cynicism about law enforcement over the years. Whitey Bulger and other instances have given us what happened with the Toda chef down in. I mean, so is this more about a racial divide about an opinion than it is? Because a lot of people can get on board with what you're saying about law enforcement getting away with stuff, but the issue over whether Michael Brown was totally innocent seems to be more of a racial.
Well, I think it's race and class because there's so many poor black people in Ferguson. It's 67% black, but 22% live below the poverty line. Not a lot of people are voting because a lot of them don't feel like citizens. So I think it's a connection between race and class. Most of the law enforcement in Ferguson targets young black men for traffic violations. And those young black men can't pay because they're unemployed and they're going from jail to jail in this Ferguson area. And one thing we have to remember, there are deeper roots to why racial segregation in Ferguson and St. Louis County proper, right? And this goes back to the New Deal and the Federal Housing Authority and how blacks didn't have access to 30-year low interest mortgages and whites did, right? So there are these decades of building a white middle class that's segregated and building a black working and very poor class that even in terms of residential zoning, black neighborhoods have businesses in the neighborhoods, liquor stores in the neighborhoods, right? White neighborhoods didn't have that, right? And so when we think about the roots of Ferguson, this goes way back in our history and it's connected to public policy. And the only way we can solve this is through public policy. And I think it's public policy that'll help both African Americans, Latinos, but whites as well.
Hope you're right. Jack McDevitt, thanks so much. Peniel Joseph, is always great to have you.
Thank you.